Well, in any software program, understanding the preferences is key. I would encourage you to look at and seek out the preferences in pretty much any program you use, just to make sure you're aware of what's features are possible, and how you might successfully change and adapt some of the tools that you may be working with in any program that you use. Photoshop is no exception to this. Photoshop's got a lot of preferences, in fact, more than most programs. And so we're going to take some time now and take a look at some of the settings that you can customize and tweak and get in there and basically modify Photoshop to do the things you need it to do. So without hesitation, let's jump into it. So we'll go to Photoshop Preferences, and you'll notice already there's a lot of subcategories in Photoshop. We'll go to General, and we'll start there. Let me bring this up so we can see it. You can see it doesn't even fit all on my screen. The window is so large. But just to let you know here on this left, all this is a column of the different categories that we're going to go through. We're going to start with General and work our way through. So I'm going to cut that part off and show you what's important, which is here in the middle. Starting with the color picker. The color picker simply lets you switch between your operating system color picker and the Adobe color picker. Stick with Adobe. That should be your default setting. That ensures that when you do the tutorials, if you ever see me use the color picker, you'll be able to understand the modifications that I'm making to the foreground or background colors. This is what the Adobe color picker looks like. You've got the hue controls over here, which sets the color itself. It's a slider that goes up and down. And then you've got the saturation and value controls over here in this box. So if you go up to the right hand side over here, from left to right, you're dealing with saturation. As you go to the left, you're getting desaturated. You go to the right, you're getting the maximum saturation of that color. As you go down, you're getting more and more dark and getting more of the blacks mixed in with your color, whatever hue you may be picking. And then you go to the top and you're getting more whites mixed in. So basically that's the Adobe color picker. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of a quick look at that. Let's jump back into the preferences and focus on the rest of these. Image interpolation. This has to do with the way that your images are calculated when Photoshop gets involved with interpolation. This mainly comes into play when you are upscaling or downscaling your images. And here it tells you exactly what the settings, which settings are best when you're doing that. So if you are looking to doing some enlarging in this session, you may want to go with Bicubic Smoother, best for enlargement, Bicubic Sharper for reduction. So most of the time I'm reducing images rather than enlarging. So Bicubic Sharper would probably be the best choice for me, or just simply Bicubic for the all-round guesstimate approach if you're not really sure and what you're going to do, and you're probably going to sharpen it anyway, and maybe you're not really too picky. You can stick with Bicubic, but I'm going to go with Bicubic Sharper. But that's just the way I work, and this is why preferences are so key. You know, I work in this way, but some people upscale more, some people don't, up or downscale all that much. So this is just the way I work. I tend to bring in larger files and shrink them down, and so Bicubic Sharper might be the way for me to go in that case. User interface font size, you can make this large or small. This is a newer preference that wasn't available before, and in earlier versions of Photoshop. It basically just lets you change the font size that you are using as part of the interface, but you have to reboot Photoshop to make this effect take place, and so I'm not going to do that. It's take too much time. You can experiment for yourself, though, if you'd like to. If you have trouble reading small text and you don't like the small size, you might try upscaling to large if you have trouble reading. Let's see. Automatically launch Bridge. Bridge is a program that connects the CS3 programs in the Adobe family. So you're probably aware, if you've bought CS3, that there are other programs out there like Adobe Illustrator, Adobe InDesign, Adobe Acrobat, in which Adobe can, the entire line of Adobe products can share files back and forth through Bridge. And this simply lets you automatically launch Bridge so that when you launch Photoshop, Bridge is already open, and that will just save you some time if you're going to be doing sharing, if you're sharing a lot of files. But again, this is why this is part of the preferences panel, because not everyone does that. Some people work exclusively with Photoshop and really have no need to launch Bridge all the time. So you kind of have to just go according to your own work habits and take it from there. So I don't use Bridge every time. I do use it a lot, but I'm not every time, so I just basically leave it off. Auto update all open documents. This has to do again with the family of Adobe products, and not just Adobe products, but other products that may be compatible with the feature. But yeah, well, okay, we're pretty much talking about Adobe. Basically, this means, let's say, for example, I've got a file that I'm working on in InDesign, and at the same time, I've got Photoshop open, and that same file is open inside of Photoshop. Well, this lets me show the changes in Photoshop that I've made in InDesign. If I made it smaller or larger or cropped it, then that would automatically update my Photoshop file. So it's not a bad thing to have checked. Whether or not you work with the other programs, it really isn't a bad thing to have checked, because it won't affect you if you don't. Beep when done. This speaks for itself. If you have a task being performed, it'll beep when it's finished. Dynamic color sliders. This basically just allows the color sliders to change on the fly as you work with them. Export clipboard. This one allows you to export the contents of your clipboard. What is the clipboard? Well, if you copy and pasted something before in a word processor, that's basically going to the clipboard when you copy it. You go edit copy, it goes to the clipboard, it's invisible, you don't see it, but when you go to edit paste, it pastes that text somewhere else. Well, it's the same in Photoshop. It goes to that magical clipboard that you don't see, and then allows that data to be transferred to another program. Like if I wanted to copy and paste a photo into a Word document, having this feature enabled is going to let me do that, and so it lets me share my files with other programs, even that aren't from Adobe. Let's see. Use the Shift key for tool switch. This is kind of, just a routine thing. Having that on just enables you to automatically use the Shift key when you're switching tools. This is not something I've even turned off or bothered to mess with. It has to do with keyboard shortcuts, and I would just leave it on. Resize image during paste in place. This is a nice new feature in Photoshop that allows you to automatically tell Photoshop that you want to rescale the image when you place an image from another document or from another program, another application. When you bring it into Photoshop, you can automatically scale that image, like an Illustrator file, for example. If I'm bringing in a logo and I want to scale it, this allows me to do that automatically without having to do it manually. Zoom resizes windows. This is another one of those kind of gimmicky things. It's not really that important, but simply what it does, it allows me, when I have a file like this, if I zoom in, you notice that the window here is automatically fitting. Pretty exciting, huh? That's basically what it does. Granted, some of this stuff's really important, some of it's not so much, but anyway. Zoom with scroll wheel, another new one, kind of nice. This allows you to use the scroll wheel on your mouse, if you have one, to zoom in and out using that scroll device, and that would zoom in and out of your image as you scroll with the wheel. But just make sure that your mouse is compatible with that, and mine is not. I'm trying to demonstrate you this, and it's not working. Oh wait, I didn't have it turned on. Let me try it again. Oh, there we go. Great. My mouse is compatible. This is a new feature. This is actually the first time I'm actually using it, but it's kind of fun. But if you're not really that keen to using your scroll wheel, it won't matter to you. Or if you just really love your scroll wheel to act as it normally does, which is to scroll up and down, then feel free to go ahead and do that. Whoops, it didn't take. There we go. Normally what the scroll wheel does is it simply moves up and down like this. Use that for web browsing quite a bit. All right, let's go back to Preferences General. Okay, let's see. Leave that on. I kind of like that. History log. The history log allows you to record all of the data from your Photoshop session. What does that mean? It's kind of hard to explain, so I'll show it to you. I'm going to save log items as a text file. That way I can open this up in Windows, excuse me, not Windows, but Microsoft Word. And I'm going to give it a name. I'll call this Photoshop log, for lack of a better title. I can save this wherever I want. As you can see, I can name it whatever I want. But what is it? What am I doing? Well, you'll see in just a second. Edit log items. This allows me to choose what kind of things I want to record. I can do a detailed recording of my session or a concise version. Let's go ahead and just try sessions only. And we'll click OK. Let's do a few things to our Photoshop file and see what happens. So I'm going to do a little modification here to my image. I'm going to make a duplicate layer. I'm going to add an adjustment layer. Don't bother trying to do this. Just watch what I'm doing. Do a little layer mask and maybe a little adjustment layer on top of that. Okay. Done a few modifications here. Now if I go to my desktop and click on it, I can see there's a file there that wasn't there before, Photoshop log.txt. That's compatible with any sort of text edit program that you can open up. Let's see, in the Windows world, I'm trying to think of what that might be called. In Macintosh, it's text edit, and I can't think of the Windows term, but bear with me. This didn't take, and I'm thinking that's because of the session, so I'm going to go back and try it again. This time I'm going to choose detailed and see if we can get it to record what we're doing. And it may be that I have to open this file from scratch in order for this to actually do something and record it, so let me try that. I'm going to close this out and open it again. Okay. Bear with me just a moment while this opens up. It's probably a lot of work just to show you something pretty simple, but anyway. Okay, let's do a few tasks here like I did before. I'm going to come in, add a mask. Let's make a new layer. And copy paste that to a new layer. Going to do some minor adjustments. All right, let's go back and see if we have any update on this. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. All right, so all this data basically is a detailed analysis of what I've done. And you can see there's my rectangular marquee that I just set up, that little rectangle you saw me drag out. The vector masks, duplicating the layer, deleting the layer, adding the layer. Every little thing that I did has been recorded down to the last detail. Even the detailed settings of the levels adjustments that I made. So why is this valuable? It really, there might be situations where you are maybe later down the road, if you have people working for you and they're using Photoshop to do projects, you want to see what they did, or you want to keep track of what they did. Hey, this is a way that you can sort of spy on your employees. If it's for you, this could be a great way to keep track of information without using a lot of hard disk space. If you try and rely on the history palette to save all your work, first of all, that gets cleared out when you quit your Photoshop file. So this is permanent, and this data could come into handy and it could save you down the road, presumably. The good thing about it is that it takes up almost no space whatsoever, so having it there is really not a burden. You can see it takes up 4K of disk space. So, what should you do? Should you have it on or not? It's just really up to you. Once again, it's something that you may find handy, and it may save you in a bind or in a pinch. But on the other hand, it may just get in your way, and you may find that it's just sort of cluttering up your desktop. So it's kind of up to you. I don't really have a use for it. Don't really use this much, so I'm going to turn mine off. All right, let's go on to the next one. I'll try to pick things up here a little bit. Otherwise, we'll be here all day long. There's a lot of preferences. Okay, the grayscale toolbar icon. Basically, this just allows you to change from a grayscale away from the color toolbar icon, just to simplify things a little bit. You know, it's really, I don't know, it's not that big a deal. There's the grayscale version, there's the color version. Hey, don't ask me why they included this, but some of this stuff's crazy. Show channels in color. Okay, this allows you to show your channels in the actual color that they exist in. And you guys don't even, if you're watching this and you're new to Photoshop, you probably don't have a clue what channels are at this point. But there's what it does. There's the color version, and there's the black and white versions that those channels normally appear in. They will be talked about. Channels will be discussed in this class, and we will get into those. But for now, just know that you can have them appear in the native black and white or in color. All right, menu colors. This just enables you to show menu background colors or not. I'm not going to waste time with this. Show tooltips. This is important. This is what you're reading right there. You see that yellow box that shows up? Whether or not that box shows up is determined by that checkbox. Now they're gone. They're not in the way. But for beginners, I highly recommend these tooltips, even for advanced users. I think they're really handy. Photoshop's such a big program that even I forget at times what things do. So having a tooltip is really useful. Okay, palettes, auto clips, collapse icon palettes. This just enables you to automatically close a palette that's maybe in the way. If you are not using it, you can have it open and close and have it automatically collapse that group when you're not presently using it. I find that I'm used to working without this feature on. I just kind of like knowing where everything is. Things don't really get in my way much, so I don't really use this. Remember palette locations. I always leave that checked because I like it when Photoshop remembers my changes on the fly. But I know that if I want to, I can always go back to my window panel and bring back a particular saved group of panels that I like, or a workspace that I like. For more information on that, check out the tutorial on navigation. Okay, let's move on to the next category, file handling. Image previews, I always save with an image preview. Icon or file size, it's up to you. Macintosh, Windows, yeah, why not? It doesn't take up a lot of extra info. It just gives you a nice quick preview to make sure you just kind of remind you what that file is before you open it. Append file extension. Basically, this just allows you to automatically add a file extension. I always want this. I don't want it to ask me about this. Always put that on. And if you're a Windows user, that's even more critical than Mac people. But you just want to have that file extension, that Photoshop file extension, the PSD file extension that lets people know it's a Photoshop file, or a PICT file, or a TIFF file, whatever that may be. All right. Of course, we're going to use lowercase with that. That's just the way extension should be. File compatibility. Prefer Adobe Camera Raw for JPEG files. Basically, this just allows you to take a JPEG file and automatically save it in the Camera Raw format. That's just what you prefer. This is, again, a new feature in Photoshop that allows you to convert JPEGs to RAW images. Prefer Adobe Camera Raw support for supported RAW files. This just enables you to switch from the RAW file support that may be built in with your camera over to the Adobe RAW file format, which is a little more standard, assuming you're going to be using Adobe for all your image editing needs. All right, moving on down the line. Ask before saving a layered TIFF file. TIFF files and Photoshop files can have multiple layers. We'll talk about that in the tutorials. You're not going to maybe understand that at this point, but Just know that if you're familiar with layers in Photoshop, they're very much the same in TIFF, but they, if you have to have it ask first, then it gives you the choice of either giving it rendering as a standard flat TIFF file or a layered TIFF file, which will take up a lot more space, but give you more flexibility in the future. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. I always turn this off. This gets really annoying. If you have it on ask, it's just gonna constantly ask you and gets in the way every time you save your file. Put it on always. You know, why not? You know, why not have your file compatible, backward compatible with earlier versions? You never know when someone with PS2 or PS1 is going to open up your file, or maybe someone with Photoshop 7. Keep it on always. Ask, okay, we already covered that. Where am I going? Okay, Version Queue. Version Queue is a program that allows you to organize and share files that you're working on with a group of people. It's something that advanced Photoshop users might get into at some point. This just ensures that it's enabled. Why not leave it checked? You're not going to use it in this class, not in the beginning level. Moving on, preferences, performance. Okay, so this basically allows you to assign what Photoshop has access to in terms of memory. So we can let it use this much memory here. I'm saying 70% of what's available. You can increase that to even further if you want. It just, you know, Photoshop is kind of a memory hound, so memory hog, and so if you want to increase this as much as possible, this is going to vary depending upon the system that you're got Photoshop installed on and what you've got in terms of hardware. History states. If you're familiar with Microsoft Word or word processing, you know that you can undo things. History states are Photoshop's way of undoing things. So think of, you know, this would be like 20 levels of undo. You can increase that or decrease it depending upon your memory capabilities of your computer. If you have a lot of memory, go ahead and go with 40 or above even if you want. Caching basically is just how programs save data on the fly, and so basically this is image data that is important, but it also can slow down your machine, and it has to do with performance issues. I would just leave it on the default for now until you get more comfortable with Photoshop. Scratch disk, okay, this is important. This basically just tells Photoshop what hard drives it can use as scratch disks. So if I want to say, for example, I've got this one here, which has got 163 gigabytes, which is quite a bit. But if I run out of scratch disk space, I'm working on a really large file or something, I may need to have a second hard drive that it has access to. And so I might say, okay, you can use this drive also, and this has got an extra 330 gigabytes of storage space, and so great. And this is especially great for those of you who have a lot of hard drives, but maybe don't have a whole lot of disk space on each one of them. So you want to share the scratch disk amongst different multiple hard drives. All right. This is a new aspect to the preference panel. It allows you to change the video, basically enables 3D acceleration. This you can't change. This is basically just telling you what Photoshop has detected as far as the graphics cards are concerned. But this is good because if you have a graphics card that it doesn't recognize, you'll know it by the fact that it's not showing up there. 3D acceleration has to do with Photoshop's new ability to work with 3D models, and it's kind of beyond this lecture, but for another time. Painting controls and cursor controls. This allows you to switch between standard, which looks like the icon of the tool, precise, which looks like a crosshair, which is really accurate, the brush tip, which shows you the width of the paintbrush you're using, or full-size brush tip, which basically uses the full size of the brush. I mean, it's just a slightly larger version of the other one. To be quite honest with you, this is a new curveball they've thrown at me, and I'm not quite sure about it. Use full size of brush for cursor shape. Okay, I think what this is going to do is it's going to basically allow us to, let me just check this out real quick. It's fun for me as well. I'm going to change from a standard brush to something that's a little bit strange, and I'm going to go a little bit larger in size so I can see this. All right, so let's paint with something black. so it shows up better. Get myself a new layer. Okay, there you get an idea. So there's what my cursor looks like. There's the shape, and there's what the actual paintbrush is like. So if you were using a more standardized brush, one of the circular brushes, it would change to represent the size of that brush. Now, that's nothing new. What's thrown me a little bit is that normal brush tip is usually kind of doing that same thing. So let's see what we've got going on here. And now I'll switch to the advanced. And I'm going to go larger with that. Yeah, it's doing the same thing, so I'm really not quite sure what the difference is, but I won't pause the tutorial to figure that out. But anyway, something for the future. We can always learn something new. Okay, so this allows you to show the crosshair inside the brush tip, which shows you the exact center of the paintbrush. The other cursors, this has to do with everything here is just for painting cursors that deal with painting in your image. Other cursors would refer to anything else. You can just have two choices, either the icon that shows you the tool you're using, or the precise option, which shows you the crosshair. Next, transparency settings. Okay, this has to do with the way transparent elements show up in Photoshop. Right now, if you look at my layers tab, you can see that, see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you, but you can see that I've got checkerboard patterns here. That indicates that I'm working on a transparent layer, which is kind of like working on a clear piece of glass, and basically I can paint on top of that glass and see through to the other layers. How that Photoshop represents transparency is what we're deciding here, okay? So we can change this to a dark grid color so it looks like that. You could go with a color version, you know, it's, again, just leave with the standard, it's fine. If you want to change the size of the checkerboard, you can do that. It's all the same thing. Gamut warning has to, gamut, that's not global warming, it's gamut warning has to do with showing you where on your image colors may be out of gamut, maybe out of range. I'm going to talk about color in another tutorial, so I'm not going to get into that, but it just has to do with when colors may be out of your print range or out of a range for a particular color space. It will warn you, given if you have the right settings turned on, and this is the color that they will show up as is gray. Units and rulers. Okay, this allows you to choose your default settings, and you know, if you're in America, you probably want inches, but if graphic designers often like to have pixels or points or picas, one of these other choices. If I'm talking about you, you'll know who you are. If I'm not, then just leave it on inches. If you're in Europe, or if you're European, or if you just love the metric system, hey, centimeters or millimeters. Actually, I shouldn't say Europe. I think just pretty much everyone in the world except us. Type, points or pixels. Really the same thing. Millimeters, that's a new option, at least for me. I leave it on points, I'm just used to that, but this basically just determines how your type settings your font settings are going to be shown to you. If you're used to using word processors like Microsoft Word, you're going to want to leave it on points, because that's really what you're used to. Okay, column size. This has to do with the column size used for image sizing. This is the standard, this is the default, gutter and width. I'm really not into layout. I don't use these, to be honest with you. I would stick with the standard preferences unless you are really into doing layout exercises and working a lot within InDesign, and you know what you're doing here, then go ahead and switch these. New document preset resolutions. This should be somewhere between 240 and 300. I use 240 just because that's kind of the way I feel and the way that I've been told print files pretty much max out at. In other words, this has to do with image resolution, which we're going to talk about in another tutorial, but I tend to leave this on 240, whereas some people leave it on 300 or even a little bit above. But I find that there's really no advantage to going above 240 for print files, so I tend to use 240. Screen resolution is 72, don't change that. And we'll talk about resolution on another tutorial. Point and pica size, this has to do with a slight variation in, slight discrepancy in size when it comes to using points. Just leave it as PostScript is my advice. But again, this is kind of something that I just don't meddle with. Guides. If you've seen the tutorial already on navigation, then you've seen me use guides. This allows you to change the colors of those. If you haven't seen that tutorial, go ahead and just wait and you'll see that. This allows you to change basically the style, the way that they look, dashed or solid, and whatever color you choose. This allows you to distinguish between smart guides and regular guides. This allows you to change the type of grid that's available to you if you're using grids. All of these have to do with organizing layers and type elements. And I really wouldn't be too concerned about this unless you find that they're just not showing up on your background and you need to change them from these colors. Most people don't design with these colors, which is why they chose them to begin with, and so you probably won't have a problem if you leave it on turquoise and magenta unless you're designing a Don Johnson 1980s Miami Vice poster, and then in which case you may need to change these from turquoise and pink because it'll probably be camouflaged with what you're doing. All right, preferences. Additional plugins folder. You can have additional plugins, maybe third-party plugins, plugins made by other companies that you want to add to the plugins folder. You can do that. And you click on the check and you show it where those plugins are located and which folder they're stashed in. And that's it. That's all this does. This has to do with serial numbers of old plugins that may require serial number authorization that you may have paid for in the past if you're a longtime Photoshop user. If you're not, just ignore it. Type options, I'm not going to get deep into this stuff, guys. It's really not that crucial, but you have certain things you can do with Asian text and glyph protection. This has to do with Photoshop will substitute in situations where a font doesn't have certain glyphs. You know, glyphs are things, you know, like the copyright symbol, the C with a circle around it, or a trademark symbol, and that kind of stuff. Not all fonts have those symbols, so if you're missing that kind of stuff, Photoshop will automatically substitute it. That's kind of nice. These other things have to do with, you know, fonts in other languages and preview sizes. It's really not that big a deal. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. Hopefully that quick run through, well, maybe it wasn't so quick after all, but hopefully that quick run through will give you some good information about how to set your preferences, what works for you. And I know I touched on a lot of things in this tutorial that really probably don't make sense to the beginner, and they will make more sense as you've gone through your tutorials in this class and when you've gone through the basics folders, and as you get into, you know, by the middle of the semester, maybe revisit the preferences and maybe even watch this tutorial again, and once you understand more of the terminology that's being used here. The reason I show this right here, right off the bat, even though you're not really familiar with the program yet in many cases, is because I just feel right from the get-go you need to know what's available in terms of the interface and basic things like that. So on the one hand it's very fundamental, on the one hand it's a little more advanced, so it's kind of one of those categories that falls into two areas. But anyway, hopefully this has been useful, and once again, of course, there's nothing to turn in for you on this particular project. But anyway, give it some practice and maybe try some of these settings in your free time. We'll see you on the next tutorial.